We started off last week talking about life. What is life? How did it begin? This week, we're really going to delve into the processes that have shaped life. So this is a little conversation about Charles Darwin, evolution by natural selection. So we're taking a look at processes, right? So I'm just showing you a couple quick slides. So we have some observation. I think they're just talking about observation versus doctrine, correct? So life's natural history, as we learned last week, is a record of successions and extinctions, right? So we're taking a look. We took a look last week at these different eras: the Precambrian, the Paleozoic, the Mesozoic, the Cenozoic. And there's an explosion of life, and then there's an extinction period, right? So I'm going to just first start off by introducing to Lamarck. He was a evolutionary biologist who said that organisms adapted to their environments by acquiring specific traits. He said that they changed during their lifetime, okay? He had this idea of disuse. So organisms lost parts during their lifetime because they did not use them, like missing eyes and digestive system of a tapeworm. Perfection with use and need. The constant use of an organ leads to that organ increase in size, like the muscles of a blacksmith or the large ears of a night-flying bat. He hypothesized that they transmit these acquired characteristics to the next generation. Now, I know we haven't discussed genetics yet, but this is like saying if you broke an arm while you were pregnant, you would pass that broken arm onto your child. Okay, so we're going to contrast Lamarck with Charles Darwin, who lived from 1809 to 1882. He was a British naturalist. A lot of people know Darwinism, natural selection, but we're going to kind of get down to the nitty-gritty of it. He proposed the idea of evolution by natural selection. He collected clear evidence to support these ideas. He went on the voyage of the HMS Beagle. It traveled around the world when he was 22 years old. He made many observations of nature. This charter was to kind of chart the South American coastline. But they stopped at the Galapagos Islands, which is 500 miles off the coast of Ecuador. So here we are right here. And it really is evolution's playground. It always has been. He found some really unique species there. And we're looking at tortoises, iguanas, blue-footed boobies, and most importantly, and probably most famously, his finches. Okay? He collected birds on the island while he was on the island, killed them, stuffed them, brought them home with him. He thought they were all different kinds of birds. They all looked so vastly different. But then he was amazed to find out that all 14 species were a type of finch. Okay, there's a large ground finch, a small ground finch, a warbler finch, and a veggie tree finch, right? But there's only one species of finch on the mainland. So how did the species of finches become so many different species? Now his curiosity was piqued, right? So he proposed, I'm sorry for the talking in the background. He proposed that there was an ancestral species and that these other birds diverged later on. There were descendant species, right? So we're taking a look here at his theories. Here's our common ancestor from the mainland in South America. And then here we have all of the species that were in the Galapagos, right? And there's a major difference he found. So we had, he was seeing that there was a correlation to their food source. So we have these really large beaked finches that were seed eaters. And then we have flower eaters, okay, taking a look at their beaks. Then we have insect eaters with these smaller, thinner beaks, right? This is what we call adaptive radiation. So rapid speciation, a new species filling a new niche. This happens because they inherited successful adaptations. And this is an idea that we come to a little bit later on. When we know more about genetics, we are going to come back to this idea and how these are transmitted over time. But if you think about it, Darwin didn't know anything about DNA or genetics or chromosomes yet. So he was just working with what he had. Differences in the beaks were associated with eating different foods. The survival and reproduction of beneficial adaptations, what happened on the island. So long story short, or to put it in simpler terms, he's saying that all of these birds could exist together on one island, but only one of them would be successful and survive and reproduce, right? The other ones would die because you can't have a seed eater on the same island with a warbler finch, because the warbler finch is going to be better adapted for its environment. This one will not have anything to eat and will die, and vice versa, right? So his conclusion shows that there's small populations of original South American finches landed on the islands. Variation in the beaks enabled individuals to gather food successfully in the different environments. So this variation occurs through mutations in DNA, but it does. This is what happens. So their physical characteristics are what are making them successful in the environment. It's really important to remember that the environment's not, well, we'll get there. Okay. So over many generations, the population of finches changed anatomically and behaviorally. So those that are the accumulation of advantageous traits were very popular in the population. And again, this is something we come back to when we talk about population genetics. And then we have this emergence of different species, right? So seeing this graduation and diversity in the structure of one small related group of birds, I'm really fancy from anyway. Yeah, okay. So we're again, the differences in the beaks allowed for some finches to successfully compete, successfully feed, successfully reproduce, and pass that successful trait on to the others. Survival of the fittest is just this. The organism, whether it's a bird or a human, that is best fit to their environment will survive, outcompete all its competitors for food, for reproduction rights, and reproduce and spread those advantageous traits onto their survivors, right, or their offspring. So you're going to see more of those, and we're going to do something classic, kind of illustrates that. Okay, so more observations. We have turtles, one of my favorite animals ever, the Isabella dome-shaped turtle, the Pinta Island intermediate shell turtle, and the Hood Island turtle. And he noticed that their neck size is correlated to what they eat. Isabella-shaped dome tortoises ate grass, where these longer necked, especially these had no grass on their islands, and they had to reach for vegetation, as well as the Pinta Island intermediate turtles, saying the same thing. They all speciated, became new species. So, excuse me. So then we're just looking at more examples of our turtles, right? Artificial selection is actually something we use quite often in everyday life. It's not just a process of the past. It's all around us today, okay? We use it all the time. If you're a gardener, if you know a farmer, we select for those traits or those, in this case, plants that are best adapted and are going to give us the most food source. We consider that artificial selection. Selective breeding, which has been done from pigeons in the past, happens all the time, but the most common form of selective breeding is, this is what we started with dogs. Dogs were all wolves. And with this selective breeding, we have these wide array of breeds of dogs now today, and that's called selective breeding, right? So we're just taking a look at the historical context, and I'm kind of just going to swim through here. It's not extraordinarily important to what we're talking about right now. All right, so Charles Darwin, a little background on him. He returned to England in 1836 and wrote his papers. He did a lot of work with barnacles, which is interesting. I did too in my undergraduate. The draft of his theory of species formation was in 1844. He instructed his wife to publish his essay upon his death. He was really reluctant to publish, but he didn't want his ideas to die with him. Okay. And then in 1858, he received a letter that changed everything. Alfred Russel Wallace, who was a young naturalist, he was working in the East Indies, he wrote a short paper that had a new idea, and he asked Darwin to evaluate his ideas and pass it along for publication. Okay. And then we kind of have the birth of the origin of the species. Okay. This is actually a very interesting book, difficult read, but Darwin, on November 24th, 1859, he published The Origin of the Species by Natural Selection, which highlighted his ideas. Let's talk about the essence of Darwin's ideas, because there's 5 major ideas when we talk about natural selection. Variation exists in natural populations. Many more offspring are born each season that can possibly survive to maturity. As a result, there is a struggle for existence, what we call competition, right? The characteristics that are beneficial in the struggle for existence will tend to become more common in the population. It's going to change the average characteristics of a population. This population idea is something we'll come back to later on. But these characteristics are something that we call adaptations. Okay? Over long periods of time, and given a steady input of new variation into the population, these processes lead to the emergence of a new species. So these are the 5 main ideas that Darwin had that have lived on. So we're going to look at Lamarck, who I was talking about before, versus Darwinian ideas. Lamarck is saying giraffes, so we're just going to say why his is wrong. In reaching for higher vegetation, the giraffes acquired a long neck and then passed it on to their offspring. And then Darwin is saying giraffes are born with longer neck. The ones that were born with longer necks were the ones that survived. So, for example, there were giraffes with all different sized necks, right? But the ones that had the long necks were the ones that survived because they could reach their food, so they lived, and they passed on their traits to their offspring. And I hope that makes sense. And that's, then make sure you write down any questions that you have for class, and that's it.